Imagine the voice of the Creator echoing not only in the Garden of Eden, but cutting across the centuries, tearing down the walls of history, and reaching the human heart even today. Where are you? This is not just a question. It is a call that has shaken empires, awakened sleeping consciences, and ignited revivals that transformed entire nations. It is the voice that exposes hidden secrets, breaks invisible chains, and confronts the soul with eternity. Moody dared proclaim that this divine question is not a distant whisper, but a trumpet blast demanding an immediate answer, an answer powerful enough to redefine destinies and rewrite history. What we speak of here is not dead religion, but a living spiritual revolution that heals, sets free, awakens, and saves. The answer you give to this question may be the dividing line between darkness and light, between loss and salvation, between death and eternal life. This is the moment when the unseen becomes real, and your eternity hangs in the balance. The message Where Art Thou? By D.L. Moody stands among the 30 most powerful sermons he ever preached. To make it clear, we divided this message into 5 points, and I invite you to follow closely every detail. In the stillness of Eden, where every leaf sparkled with the morning dew and rivers flowed in perfect harmony, the voice of God broke forth like a gentle thunder. Where art thou? Genesis 3 verse 9. This question was not directed only at Adam. It pierced through the centuries like a flaming arrow, striking generations and awakening slumbering consciences. Dwight Lyman Moody, born in 1837 on a humble farm in Northfield, Massachusetts, carried this echo so deeply in his ministry that his words ignited crowds and rekindled the fire of faith across entire continents. Having lost his father as a child and grown up in poverty, Moody knew firsthand the weight of human helplessness. Perhaps that is why his preaching had the power to confront and embrace the lost soul at the same time. He didn't merely speak about religion. He exposed the spiritual drama of separation between man and God, awakening hearts with that same garden question. Where art thou? Not as an accusation, but as an invitation to reconciliation. The secret of Moody's impact lay not only in his eloquence, but in the force of conviction that overflowed from his words. His style was direct, simple, yet filled with an irresistible urgency, as if every sermon were the last call before eternity. In the midst of the Industrial Revolution, when cities swelled and crowds were drawn to the glitter of modernity, Moody raised his voice to remind them that no human achievement could silence the emptiness of the soul. His gatherings drew thousands, with historic accounts describing packed halls, people in tears, hardened men surrendering, and entire families being transformed. He offered not just moral teaching, but a living path of reconciliation, exposing the spiritual reality of the fall and the urgent need for redemption. As Romans 3 verse 23 declares, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Moody laid bare the truth that every human being must answer God's call. It was impossible to sit under his preaching without sensing that something greater was stirring, a revival that crossed borders and shook social structures. His ministry did not remain confined to the United States. It crossed oceans, setting hearts ablaze in places like England, Scotland, and beyond. In London, for example, his sermons gathered more than 20,000 people in a single night, with the impact spilling into streets, schools, prisons, and homes. This was not a local phenomenon, but a movement that reshaped the morality of entire cities, restored families, inspired missions, and forged a generation of Christian leaders who carried the message even farther. Moody made it clear that sin was not merely an abstract error, but a real separation from God, and that ignoring the divine question meant choosing to remain lost in spiritual darkness. He wielded the word both as sword and bomb, confronting and healing all at once. At the heart of it all, the divine question repeated like an eternal refrain. Where art thou? Moody applied it not only to common men, but also to leaders, intellectuals, and even religious figures who lived by appearances without true communion with God. The strength of his message lay in revealing that no one was exempt from this call. Everyone had to face their own spiritual condition. His preaching stripped the soul bare, tore off masks, and brought into the light what many try to hide even from themselves. As Hebrews 4 verse 12 declares, "For the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even the dividing soul and spirit. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart." That was the impact of his words, not merely a sermon heard, but an experience lived. Moody believed that true transformation was never achieved through human persuasion, but through the Holy Spirit working by the Word. His role, as he often said, was simply to proclaim God's truth with clarity and urgency. The results were undeniable. Crowds surrendered, hearts healed, sinners reconciled, and a flame of revival rekindled the hope of an entire generation. The question, "Where art thou?" became, in his hands, more than an ancient echo. It was a living, pulsing, irresistible call that demanded an immediate response. And that response not only changed individual lives, but carried the power to alter the destiny of families, communities, and even nations. This was a legacy of a man who dared to turn God's question into a spiritual revolution that still echoes today in every heart willing to listen. At the heart of Moody's message about Eden, what struck people most was the way he carried his listeners straight into humanity's very first scene, making them feel the crushing weight of Adam's shame as he hid among the trees. He painted the moment as a universal drama, one in which every man and woman of every generation could see themselves reflected. With a voice both firm and compassionate, Moody portrayed the picture of lost innocence. A garden that once echoed with communion had now become a stage of fear and separation. He declared, God didn't ask Adam where he was because he didn't know. Of course he knew. But the question was asked so Adam himself would realize where he stood, so that all of humanity would awaken to the reality of its fall. When people heard these words, entire crowds were overwhelmed by the sense that God himself was speaking directly to them, exposing the frailty of their own attempts to run and hide. Moody was careful to show that the problem wasn't only Adam and Eve's, but every man and woman since then who chooses to hide behind excuses, traditions, pleasures, and illusions. He compared the lost Eden with the reality of the booming industrial cities of the 19th century, where throngs of people drowned themselves in the clamor of factories, the frenzy of commerce, and the blinding glitter of progress. You can fill your days with work and your nights with pleasure, he would say, but you cannot silence the voice that asks, "Where are you?" Those words fell like thunder, because the audience saw themselves in that description. Exhausted workers, wealthy businessmen, young people chasing excitement, all, without exception, were suddenly brought face to face with the same divine question. The parallel between Eden's past and the present streets of London or Chicago made the message cut even deeper. The impact grew stronger when Moody showed that the fall carried not only spiritual consequences, but also social and emotional ones. He pointed out that broken families, corrupted societies, and rising injustices were all echoes of that same rupture in the garden, drawing on Genesis 3 verse 10. And he said, "I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself." Moody highlighted that fear, shame, and separation still ruled the human heart. He described Adam's nakedness not merely as the absence of clothing, but as the exposure of the soul before its creator. That interpretation brought many to tears, because it revealed a vulnerability that mirrored the secret wounds people carried in silence. To Moody, there was no difference between Adam's sin and the lies, addictions, and corruptions of modern society. All of it testified to a humanity still desperate to hide from God. Yet what fascinated most was how Moody transformed this bleak scene into a doorway of hope. He would proclaim, if God had no love, he would have left man in the silence of the fall. But instead, he came into the garden and called. Then he would add, the same God who sought Adam is still seeking you today. His words were more than theological reflection. They were a living summons, an urgent cry. Many who heard him felt as though they had been transported back to Eden, not just witnessing the scene, but living it themselves. His ability to weave the ancient past with the pressing present, scripture with daily life, made his sermons more than speeches. They became spiritual encounters. And so, every word reinforced the unshakable conviction that Eden's loss was never meant to be the end of the story, but the beginning of a divine pursuit that continues to this very moment. Moody understood that the secret to leading multitudes to repentance was not found in eloquence or theatrics, but in laying bare, clearly and compassionately, the contrast between what humanity was created to be and what it had become by choosing to hide from God. He described Eden not merely as a physical garden, but as a symbol of perfect communion, a state where there was no pain, no death, no separation. He painted the biblical account as a living portrait, a mirror in which every listener could see themselves reflected. Creatures once called to walk side by side with their Creator, now crawling under the crushing weight of guilt. In his words, there was no room for neutrality. The fallen man was, indeed, far from God. "You may pretend you don't hear me," he would declare, "but the divine call pierces every wall you raise. It reaches your heart in the silence of the night and asks, 'Where are you?'" That was the breaking point in his sermons, the moment when many realized Adam's story was also their own. In halls lit by oil lamps, packed with factory workers and humble families, Moody spoke with vivid images, comparing Adam's hiding to the way men of his day concealed themselves behind new technologies, money, and social appearances. While the Industrial Revolution promised limitless progress, Moody reminded them that no invention could restore the peace of a lost conscience. "You may build machines strong enough to move the world," he said, "but you cannot move even an inch of the burden of sin that weighs upon your heart." This striking comparison with modern life created an irresistible tension, showing that the spiritual dilemma was not a relic of the past, but a present reality throbbing in the back alleys of London, on the streets of Chicago, and in every city reshaped by steam and steel. Just as Adam hid among the trees, modern crowds were hiding behind the gears and smoke of industry, yet still stood naked before God. Moody emphasized that God's question was not only an invitation, but also a solemn warning. He insisted that the fall could not be romanticized, for its consequences were real and devastating. "Sin does not only separate us from God," he declared, "it separates us from ourselves. It destroys our peace, it shatters homes, it corrupts societies." At that moment, he would bring in real-life examples of his time. Men destroyed by alcohol, families torn apart by violence, young people drifting without hope. Each story became living proof that Eden's tragedy was being repeated in every generation. And just as Adam lost access to the tree of life, modern sinners were also cut off from true joy and spiritual safety. The sermon took on the weight of social drama, yet never lost its spiritual core, because Moody showed that behind every human tragedy lay the same root: the separation between man and God. Yet, in the midst of the severity of his message, tenderness would emerge like a dawn breaking through the night. Moody declared that if God was still calling, it was because there was still hope of return. He would say, "The very God who once walked in the cool of the garden now walks among you through his Spirit, asking, 'Where are you?'" That statement echoed like both a hammer and a bomb, breaking down resistance while bringing comfort. The image was clear. Just as God had not given up on Adam, he had not given up on any listener sitting there that night. That fusion of confrontation and love, of judgment and grace, created an atmosphere where the decision seemed inevitable. The lost garden was transformed into the scene of a possible reunion, and the divine question became not only a reminder of the fall, but a promise of reconciliation. With every word, Moody made it unmistakably clear. No one was beyond God's reach, and the answer to that call had the power to redefine an entire life, and even an entire generation. Moody had a rare gift. He could take the ancient story of Eden and make it feel so present, so alive, that his listeners felt as if it were unfolding right before their eyes. He described God walking in the garden at the cool of the day, calling out to man with a voice that carried both tenderness and judgment. That image of the divine presence, seeking someone who was hiding, was too powerful to ignore. He often said, "It is not man who seeks God. It is God who comes after man, even when he hides." And as those words rang out, the crowds realized that the account in Genesis was not a distant memory, but a portrait of mercy in action. Moody insisted that if God had abandoned Adam at that moment, human history would have been nothing but tragedy. Yet the call proved there was hope. Each person in the audience was confronted with the truth. There was still time, still room to respond to that eternal voice echoing in their hearts. In his sermons, Moody also drew out the sharp contrast between Adam's shame and God's love. He painted the moment in dramatic colors, showing how man, upon realizing his nakedness, stitched fig leaves together to cover himself. For Moody, that was a perfect picture of humanity's endless attempts to cover its own guilt with works and appearances. "You may sow your own fig leaves, good deeds, rituals, traditions, but they will never hide the truth from God," he proclaimed. That illustration spanned centuries, exposing both the sinner of the 19th century and the sinner of today. Empty religion, shallow morality, the hunger for social approval. All were shown to be fragile leaves that dry up in the burning light of divine holiness. No one could hear those words without feeling exposed. For Moody stripped away every crutch men leaned upon, leaving them naked before the truth. The power of his preaching was in tying the lost Eden to the tangible struggles of his own time. In an age intoxicated by science and the promises of human progress, Moody warned that no invention could ever clothe the soul's nakedness. He made bold comparisons. You can build locomotives that cross continents, but you cannot cross the abyss that stands between you and God. Those words carried weight because they struck at the pride of society drunk on technology. By placing Eden at the center of modern life, Moody revealed that man had not changed at all, still fleeing from God, still hiding behind achievements and rationalizations. His approach didn't just shock, it disarmed. His listeners realized there was no way out, that the question, "Where art thou?" was personal, inescapable, and demanded an answer. Then came the climax of his message. Moody unveiled that God's question was less a summons to court than a rescue mission. He declared, "If God is asking where you are, it is because he has already gone out in search of you. He has not abandoned you in your shame." Those words made crowds tremble, for they uncovered a hidden side of the divine call. The relentless love that keeps searching even when all seems lost. Historical accounts tell of men collapsing to their knees in tears, women confessing sins aloud, and young people surrendering their lives to Christ in the midst of the multitude. It was as if Eden had come alive again, as if each person stood among the trees, hearing God call their name. Moody made it clear that no one could leave unchanged. The response had to be given. And so every word, every comparison, every well-placed silence created the space for transformation, a change that not only reshaped individuals but set families, communities, and even nations ablaze with new life. Moody understood that the scene in Eden was never meant to be viewed merely as a tragedy of the past, but as a mirror in which every person's time, and ours, must see themselves reflected. He led his listeners to realize that, deep down, they all carried Adam's same response: to run, to deny, to excuse, to hide. But he didn't stop there. With growing intensity, he declared, "There is no cave so dark, no crowd so loud, no fortune so great that it can shield you from the eyes of God." He still asks, "Where art thou?" That phrase struck like a hammer in his preaching, cutting deep into the hearts of the people. The impact was so powerful that many testified they felt as if God himself were calling them personally, right there in the midst of the crowd. By the end of each message, the lost garden was no longer just a memory of the fall. It had become the stage for an unavoidable encounter with truth. The richness of Moody's message lay in how he exposed the human conscience in the face of God's call. He showed that, just as Adam was confronted in his nakedness, modern man cannot escape spiritual reality. He didn't limit himself to theological abstractions of sin, but revealed its concrete effects: broken homes, uncontrollable addictions, injustices corroding society. To him, these were not merely social issues but spiritual wounds, symptoms of the same rupture that began in Eden. "Do you see the open sores of the world?" he asked. "They are only the reflection of the wounds carved into the human heart." That approach shocked with its clarity, but it also liberated, because it revealed a deeper cause and, therefore, a greater remedy. The lost garden was not the final destination, but the starting point of a promise of restoration. What made his words irresistible was the way he interwove judgment with mercy. Moody never downplayed the gravity of the fall, yet he refused to leave his listeners drowning in despair. He built an atmosphere of tension only to open a window of hope. "If God calls me by name," he said, "it means there is still a way back. I may be lost, but I am not forgotten." That certainty lifted weary hearts, bringing tears of repentance and songs of joy in the very same meetings. Historical accounts record that, in his campaigns, hundreds would surrender in a single night, with many testifying that they felt as though they'd been found in the garden of their own lives. It was a living application of Romans 5, verse 8. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. As he brought that moment of the sermon to a close, Moody made it clear that Adam's story was not only about the fall, but about confrontation and decision. The question, "Where art thou?" demanded an immediate answer, because every heart knew exactly where it stood before God. This was the climax of his preaching on the lost garden, to lead each soul to recognize their spiritual condition and prepare them to grasp the weight of guilt and the reality of separation, truths that will be unfolded next. It was as if he were saying, today you may still be hiding, but tomorrow may be too late. God calls now, and your eternity rests on your response. With that transition, Moody not only concluded Eden's scene, but opened the way toward the next step of the spiritual journey, the unavoidable confrontation with the weight of guilt. Moody began the second part of his message by leading his listeners into an even deeper dive into the drama of the fall, the unbearable weight of guilt. He painted the scene of Eden after disobedience with such vivid detail that it seemed to pull the audience out of their own reality and place them right there in that moment. Adam, once full of confidence and joy, now hid in shame, unable to face his creator. Moody declared, "Sin doesn't just separate us from God, it drives us to run from him, like a criminal fleeing from the light of justice." This image became a solemn warning he repeated often. He made it clear that Adam's fear wasn't an accident, but the direct result of a guilty conscience awakened for the first time in history. And from there he added, "Conscience is God's secret courtroom within every man. You may deceive the whole world, but you can't silence the voice that accuses you inside." No one could remain indifferent, because each listener saw themselves in that place of hiding, wrestling with their own guilt. To strengthen his message, Moody drew on examples from his own day. He spoke of men highly respected in society, who by night were haunted by memories and hidden sins. He would say, "You may carry an honored name before the world, but within you there's a judge that never sleeps." The comparison struck businessmen, politicians, laborers, even religious leaders who sat before him. In an age of rapid change and advancement, Moody reminded them that no human progress could silence the voice of conscience. Science explained the movement of the stars. Factories could transform entire cities, but no earthly power could erase the guilt that ate away at the human heart. He tied this reality back to Genesis 3, verse 10, and he said, "I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself." The shame of Adam became a mirror for every person still hiding centuries later, wandering in the labyrinths of their own conscience. The strength of Moody's preaching lay in describing guilt not merely as an emotion, but as a spiritual prison. He spoke of the soul as one dragging invisible chains, trying to move forward, yet always pulling the weight of the past. You may smile through the day, but when night comes and you close your eyes, those chains tighten even more, he said. It was a frightening picture, but a real one, because many in the crowd felt that same weight in their own lives. At the same time, Moody reminded them that guilt was not only personal, but collective. Entire peoples, nations, and generations carried the scars of injustice and sent echoing through time. This broadened the scope of his message, showing that the fall hadn't just wounded one family in Eden, but had torn open a wound that bled across all humanity. His listeners began to understand that guilt was not abstract, it was concrete, present in every corner of society. The turning point came when Moody revealed that guilt could never be ignored or buried. He proclaimed, "You may try to drown that voice with pleasure, smother it with business, or even numb it with dead religion, but sooner or later it will cry out inside you again." At that moment, silence would fill the hall, because every person knew he was describing their own life. Eyes filled with tears, hands trembled, and many began to realize that the voice of conscience was not an enemy, but God's instrument leading them to repentance. Moody showed that guilt was living proof that humanity had turned away from its creator, but also evidence that God was still calling, still searching, still reaching out. The lost garden became, in his sermon, the courtroom of conscience, where each one had to answer the divine question. And it became clear, the weight of guilt was no ordinary burden, but cry from eternity itself, calling mankind back to God. Moody pressed forward with rising intensity, making it clear that guilt was not just a fleeting feeling, but a deep spiritual reality that left lasting scars on the human soul. He reminded his listeners that when Adam heard the voice of God, he didn't run toward him, he hid. That same act, Moody declared, has been repeated by every sinner throughout history. You may hide behind religion, behind culture, behind good works, but guilt follows you like a shadow you cannot escape. The The comparison struck with undeniable force as he told stories of businessmen, politicians, even religious leaders who admitted to carrying an emptiness, a torment that no achievement could silence. He explained that even the science of his day had begun to study how remorse affected the human body, pointing to physical symptoms like insomnia, anxiety, and nervous disorders. But he added that those were only the outward signs of a much deeper spiritual wound. Blending historical observation with biblical truth, he painted guilt as an invisible poison, corroding the soul and spreading its poison through every corner of life. He spared no bold comparisons, often dragging the everyday routines of his listeners into the heart of the sermon. You go about your work in the daytime as if nothing is wrong. But at night, when everything is quiet, the courtroom of your conscience rises against you. And no matter how hard you try, you cannot silence that judge. These words struck home instantly, describing the hidden battles of nearly everyone in the audience. Exhausted workers saw themselves in his examples. Weary mothers and fathers under the weight of modern life recognized the same truth. Moody knew that by confronting the conscience, he awakened something that could not be denied. He declared that sin was like a mounting debt that could never be paid in human strength, and guilt was a daily receipt reminding the debtor that one day payment would be demanded. The metaphor was piercing, bringing eternity into the everyday world of ordinary people and exposing that they were not merely indebted to society or family, but to God himself. Yet Moody never left his hearers crushed beneath despair. He insisted that guilt was not only a punishment, but also evidence of grace. If you still feel the weight of guilt, he proclaimed, thank God for it, because it means he is still speaking to you. Far worse would be to feel nothing at all, for that would mean you've drifted so far that you can no longer hear his voice. This unexpected turn brought a breath of hope into a heavy moment, showing that even the burden of conscience was proof that God still sought after man. Testimonies from the time tell of sudden sobs breaking out in the crowd, of hardened men falling to their knees, and women rising to declare that they had finally found peace after years of torment. What once felt like an unbearable weight was revealed to be a sign that the way back to God was still open. Finally, Moody prepared his audience for the next movement in his message, warning them that guilt was never neutral. It was a danger demanding a response. Do not treat the voice of your conscience as your enemy, he cautioned, for it is the alarm bell warning that something must be made right. Every day you ignore that call, you drift further from the God who is seeking you. Spoken with grave solemnity, the warning created a tension that no one could escape. The crowd realized it was not enough merely to recognize their guilt. They had to face what it meant in relation to their separation from God. Moody made it clear that hiding could not last forever, and sooner or later every soul will be confronted by that same divine question, where are you? In this way, the weight of guilt not only exposed sin but prepared the ground to reveal the vast spiritual chasm that Moody would unfold in the moments yet to come. Moody then went deeper into his message, showing that guilt was not just an inner torment, but something that spread into every area of human life. He compared the guilty heart to a collapsing house, where every cracked wall symbolized broken relationships, shattered dreams, and the loss of inner peace. You can try to paint over the cracks, he said. You can hang beautiful pictures on crumbling plaster, but the fractures remain, and sooner or later the whole house will fall. That simple yet devastating image drew sighs and tears from listeners who knew all too well what it meant to live in a home torn apart, with distant children or hidden guilt. He showed that sin not only separated man from God, but also set man against man, creating divisions that multiplied from generation to generation. It was as if God's voice, asking where you, was directed not only to individuals, but also to entire families and communities falling apart because they refused to face their true condition. He also connected the weight of guilt with humanity's inability to find real rest. In an age when crowds were swept up by the relentless pace of the Industrial Revolution, Moody declared that not even physical exhaustion could silence the unrest of the soul. You may work until you collapse from fatigue, but when you lay your head down, your conscience wakes you in the middle of the night, he proclaimed. This was one of the strongest parts of his message, because it reflected the reality of factory workers laboring 12 to 14 hours a day and still unable to find peace. Guilt was like an inner clock that never stopped ticking, reminding everyone that the question from Eden still had not been answered. As they listened, Many realized that their restless pursuit of sustenance, progress, or pleasure was nothing more than an attempt to escape God's call, and none of those pursuits could ever suffice. Moody stressed that guilt also had the power to shape a person's future, dragging them into darker and darker choices. He warned that when the voice of conscience is repeatedly ignored, the heart begins to harden. The sin you justify today will be the burden that crushes you tomorrow, he declared with authority. That statement carried an almost prophetic force, exposing the destructive cycle everyone knew but few dared to face. He gave examples of young people who started with small lies or seemingly harmless habits, only to end up destroying their lives, their families, and even their health. At that point, Moody tied the stories of his day back to Adam's drama, showing that the price of running from God was always rising. Unconfessed guilt was like a debt that grew and grew until it finally demanded payment in tears, losses, and despair. And at the peak of that tension, Moody revealed that guilt was not merely a reminder of the fall, but also preparation for redemption. God does not allow you to carry this weight to destroy you, but to lead you back to Him, he said with a voice filled with tenderness. That was a turning point. The same conscience that tormented was also a sign that the Father was still calling. As 2 Corinthians 7 verse 10 declares, "For godly sorrow produces repentance leading to salvation." Moody showed that the weight of guilt could become a bridge to freedom. That truth brought instant relief, as listeners realized they were not doomed to live under that burden forever. The lost garden, once a stage of fear and hiding, now became the place where hope began to bloom, preparing hearts to understand both the depth of separation and the grandeur of the reconciliation that was about to be proclaimed. Moody pressed on with his message, now unveiling that guilt does more than weigh on the soul. It reshapes the very identity of fallen man. He described how Adam, who once walked in full communion with his Creator, began to define himself by fear and shame. "I was naked and I hid myself," echoed Adam's confession, showing that the cry of the first man is a confession of all humanity. For Moody, this was not merely a historical record, but the portrait of every sinner who, in silence, repeats the same words within, "I am naked, I am ashamed, I am hiding." That instant identification led his listeners into an unavoidable reflection. If the first man, created in perfection, could not withstand the weight of guilt, how could they, fragile and imperfect, hope to escape without facing the reality of their own condition? The sermon grew stronger as Moody highlighted how guilt distorts the way we see life itself. He compared the guilty heart to a fog lens. Nothing is clear, not the neighbor, not the self, not even God. He reminded his audience that in his day the cities were shrouded in thick factory smoke, darkening the skies and clouding the horizon. So it is with guilt, he declared. It raises a dense cloud between you and God, and even at midday, everything feels like night. The picture struck deeply, for his hearers lived daily under soot and industrial pollution. Just as smoke blocked out the sun, guilt veiled the truth, blinding them to the path of reconciliation. Moody also showed that guilt becomes an inheritance, passed from generation to generation like a chain binding children to their parents' choices. He recounted stories of homes marked by alcoholism, violence, or the absence of Christian values, then said, "You think you're hiding alone, but your families bear the weight of what you conceal." This pierced the hearts of parents, who suddenly realized their decisions shaped not only their own lives, but the destinies of their children. Sin, Moody taught, is never just an isolated act. It is a seed planted in fertile soil, spreading roots of pain and destruction. Guilt, then, was not merely personal. It was collective, rippling outward like waves on a lake, touching everyone nearby. And when it seemed there was no way out, Moody brought back a note of hope, revealing that the voice of guilt could be transformed into the voice of deliverance. The same God who asked Adam where he was is asking you today, not to condemn you, but to draw you back, he proclaimed. That shift in tone ignited something new within his listeners, like a flame flickering in the darkness. Many testified they felt as though an unseen hand was reaching toward them, inviting them to leave their hiding place and step into the light. Moody made it clear, guilt was never meant to have the final word, but to serve as the beginning of a new chapter. Yet he warned that to ignore this call was to play with eternity, and that every heart had to decide, would they keep running or surrender to the divine invitation? His message laid the groundwork for the next, most decisive revelation. The deep separation guilt had carved between man and God, and the urgent need to answer the call before it was too late. As Moody brought this part of his message to a close, he made it clear that guilt was not merely an unbearable burden, but a reality that shaped the eternal destiny of every human being. He described the conscience as a kind of tribunal, one that begins its judgment even before the final day of reckoning. You may try to run from the voice that accuses you, he declared, but you cannot escape the day when you will give an account before God. His words were not delivered as a threat, but as a compassionate warning, an urgent reminder that ignoring guilt was nothing less than denying a truth that would inevitably come to light. He reminded his listeners that many tried to silence the weight within through pleasures or excuses, but in the end, God's question still echoed. Where are you? At that moment, each heart was invited to look inward and admit there was no way to escape spiritual reality. He explained that guilt was only the symptom of a deeper disease, sin, and that without reconciliation with God, the wound would never heal. Moody spoke with disarming clarity. You can change cities, change friends, change your lifestyle, but you cannot change your heart unless Christ transforms it. The force of these words cut through every illusion of human solutions. He illustrated with real accounts of men and women who tried to start over, yet carried the same crushing load with them, like travelers who change their location but drag along the same baggage. To Moody, guilt was evidence that humanity didn't need cosmetic reforms, but brand new life, born of God's grace. This truth, spoken with such urgency, left the crowds knowing they were standing before a decision that could no longer be postponed. The preacher went further, insisting that guilt, though painful, was often God's tool to break human pride. He proclaimed that many would never seek the Lord if not pressed down by the weight of conscience. God allows your conscience to ache, he said, so that you understand you cannot move forward on your own. What seemed like despair suddenly became an opportunity, as listeners realized that their inner torment could be the very first step towards spiritual healing. The burden, paradoxically, was a veiled invitation, a heavenly call hidden within the soul's anguish. That revelation shocked many, as it unveiled a redemptive purpose even in suffering. Historical accounts from his campaigns tell of men and women who, after years of carrying hidden guilt, finally found relief when they understood they were not being destroyed by it, but drawn to God through it. Moody pointed to such testimonies as living proof that the gospel was not mere doctrine, but power to transform. The crushing weight of guilt became, for many, the very place where new life was born, restored, forgiven, and free. Each testimony stood as a witness to the truth that no one is doomed to live forever enslaved by conscience. There was a way out, a return to Creator. This chain of evidence showed that guilt did not have to end in condemnation, but could instead become the doorway to a new beginning. And so, as he transitioned to the next theme, Moody's tone softened but grew more intense. The weight of guilt only shows us how far we have strayed. But the question remains, how great is the distance that this separation has created between us and God? With that, he prepared his audience for the next stage of the journey, the sobering reality of separation. And here I turn to you, dear listener. Are you being stirred by this message? Thank you for staying with us this far. If this word has touched your heart, take a moment now to subscribe, leave your comment, and share with others. Stay with us, because what comes next will reveal even deeper truths, secrets that could completely transform the way you see your spiritual life. Moody led his listeners into an even deeper understanding, showing them that guilt was not just a passing burden, but the visible sign of a dreadful and final separation between man and God. He declared, "Sin has opened a chasm so wide that no human effort can ever cross it. You may build every bridge of morality, philosophy, science, or dead religion, but none of them will ever reach the other side." The image was so vivid and undeniable that people felt as if they were standing on the edge of a spiritual cliff with no way of escape. Moody compared this condition to that of a traveler lost in a vast desert, surrounded by sand on every side, with no compass and no water. Such is the soul separated from God, he preached. It walks but never arrives. It seeks but never finds. It drinks but is never satisfied. These words pierced the crowd like an arrow, laying bare the emptiness that neither wealth nor pleasure nor fame could ever fill. He emphasized that this separation was not merely symbolic, but real and eternal. Quoting Isaiah 59 verse 2, But your iniquities have separated between you and your God. He showed that the spiritual chasm was more than a metaphor. It was the ultimate barrier that kept humanity from returning to the presence of God. Moody reminded them that just as Adam was driven from Eden and forbidden to touch the tree of life, so too every sinner stood barred from eternal fellowship. The audience listened in hushed silence, gripped by the weight of this truth. He went on to say that just as the gates of Eden were guarded by cherubim with a flaming sword, so too the gates of heaven stood closed to the one still chained by guilt. The description stirred fear, but also awakened a desperate sense of urgency. It was not enough to recognize guilt. One had to grasp the sheer gravity of the distance it had created. Moody drew bold comparisons with the technological progress of his day. While many took pride in feats of engineering, tunnels carved in mountains, bridges uniting distant regions, he reminded them that none of these could span the gulf between man and God. You may cross oceans, you may link continents with telegraph cables, he said, but you cannot send a single message across the chasm between heaven and the guilty soul. The application stunned his audience, reducing humanity's proudest achievements to dust in the light of eternity. Moody stripped away every false confidence in earthly advancement, showing that without divine intervention, separation would remain eternal. By placing the spiritual drama within the context of contemporary life, he made the message tangible. No matter how far mankind advanced, it could never solve its greatest tragedy. And at that point, he would pause dramatically, letting silence speak louder than words. The crowd no longer merely listened. They felt the weight of separation pressing on their very lives. Then Moody concluded, "Do you know where you are? You are far from God, cut off by a gulf you cannot cross. And unless you face this reality, you will go on walking in darkness, without direction, without hope." This was not the end of his message, but the creation of an irresistible suspense. Every listener longed to know whether there was a way back, a bridge strong enough to unite once more the sinner and his creator. With this, Moody prepared the ground to take his audience even deeper into the story of the fall, showing that acknowledging separation was a first step toward desiring reconciliation. Moody continued his sermon by stressing that separation from God was not some abstract theological idea, but reality felt in the daily life of every human being who lives apart from him. He described life without divine fellowship as a long, desolate road where a man keeps walking but never finds a destination, keeps harvesting but is never satisfied, keeps living but never finds meaning. You may accumulate wealth, fill your barns, even gain the whole world, he declared. Yet you will still lie down at night with an empty heart, because you are separated from the very source of life. His words struck the audience like a mirror, for many knew deep down that even with success in business or social standing, they remained restless and unfulfilled. Moody wasn't vague. He painted the separation so vividly that it was as if every listener could feel the distance carved into their own chest. He then reinforced his message with Ephesians 2 verse 12. At that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope, and without God in the world. Quoting this gave his words an undeniable authority, leaving no doubt that separation from God was the most dreadful mark of the human condition. Moody explained that to live without hope and without God was the greatest tragedy of all, even if one was surrounded by comfort and pleasure. He reminded them that many in his day believed that civilization and progress could replace faith, but he challenged his hearers. With all this modern advancement, are you truly closer to God or further away from him? That piercing question forced every heart to confront the reality that the spiritual chasm was far more devastating than any material hardship. Moody then compared the separation to a wall built by man's own hands against the Creator. Every lie told, every sin committed, every truth rejected is another brick placed in that wall that shuts you off from God, he warned. You are building this wall with your own hands, and by the time you notice it, it's already too high to climb. The simplicity of this image made it all the more striking, and many in the audience could see their own condition as if staring at the rising wall before them. It was not a barrier God had built. It was theirs, and yet it was utterly unscalable. This sobering vision moved many to tears, as they saw themselves as prisoners inside a fortress they themselves had constructed. Finally, Moody delivered the gravest note. This separation does not end with earthly life, but extends into eternity. He warned, If you pass through this life separated from God, you will pass through eternity the same way, without return and without hope. The silence that followed was heavy, as the weight of those words settled over every soul present. The preacher made it plain. There was no neutral ground. To remain separated from God was to choose an eternal destiny of distance from Him. That revelation didn't merely shock. It ignited an urgency that could not be ignored. Every minute suddenly seemed priceless. Every breath an invitation to repent before eternity closed its door. In this way, Moody led his listeners to see that separation from God was not just a condition. It was a mortal danger, and only a desperate longing for reconciliation could bridge the gulf. Moody pressed the point even further, showing that separation from God not only created distance, but plunged man into such a deep state of spiritual alienation that he could no longer even recognize his own condition. He declared, "The most dreadful thing about sin is not only that it separates you from God, but that it deceives you into believing you can live without Him." That sentence fell over the crowd like a silent thunderclap, exposing the most dangerous lie of all, the false sense of autonomy. For Moody, this was the darkest portrait of Eden lost, humanity striving to build its own life while being unaware it was spiritually dead. He reminded them of John 15, verse 5, where Jesus said, "Apart from me you can do nothing," and he insisted that every human attempt at fulfillment apart from Christ could only end in emptiness. That truth pierced straight to the pride of his generation, who trusted that science, industrial progress, or politics could somehow replace dependence on God. He drove the point home with vivid imagery. Humanity adrift on an open sea, without rudder and without harbor, carried helplessly by the currents of sin. "You may row with all your strength," he proclaimed, "but without Christ, you will always row in circles, drifting farther and farther from the shore." That simple yet powerful metaphor etched itself into the minds of his listeners, who felt the despair being lost at sea, directionless, hopeless, exhausted. Many saw themselves in that picture, realizing that no matter how hard they struggled, their lives remained chained to the same sins, the same frustrations, the same gnawing emptiness. Such plain, dramatic language made the depth of separation unmistakable, even to the simplest hearer, and revealed the danger of remaining apart from God. Moody went on to remind them that this alienation was not only personal but collective, infecting entire societies. He pointed to the moral decay of great cities, the rise of injustice, and the corruption in government as evidence of a world estranged from its creator. You look at your streets filled with violence, your factories filled with exploitation, your courts filled with injustice, and you think this is just a social problem. I tell you, it is the fruit of separation between man and God. That direct application struck deep because it showed that the issue was not just out there, but within every heart that chose to live apart from the divine presence. Moody warned that until man was reconciled to God, the world could never know true justice or peace. Then came the most sobering note. Separation left man utterly incapable of finding his way back on his own. You cannot leap across the abyss. You cannot scale the wall. You cannot row to the harbor unless God Himself comes to meet you, he declared solemnly. That conclusion stripped away human pride and confronted his audience with their absolute dependence on divine intervention. Yet, in that same moment, Moody cracked the door open to hope, preparing them to hear that the same God who once asked, "Where are you?" had already provided the way of reconciliation. The suspense was irresistible. Listeners were left on the edge of revelation, with the unshakable sense that they stood before a secret about to be unveiled, a truth powerful enough to change everything. Moody went on to describe separation as nothing less than a state of spiritual death, a condition where a man may breathe, work, laugh, and even prosper outwardly, yet deep inside he is cut off from the very source of life. He reminded his listeners of the words in Ephesians 2, verse 1, "And you He made alive, who were dead in trespasses and sins," to show that this was not mere weakness, but an actual death, unseen by human eyes but crystal clear to God. "You may appear alive in the eyes of the world," he declared, "but if you are without Christ, you are dead before God." The blunt force of that truth struck like lightning. Men and women who prided themselves on their respectability suddenly realized that, in the light of heaven, their lives were nothing but shadow and vanity when lived in separation. Moody pressed the point that the spiritual death was the root of all human anguish, For no one can live in fullness while cut off from the presence of the divine. He widened the picture by likening the separation to a thick, suffocating darkness, the kind that once fell over Egypt in the days of Moses, a night so heavy it could be felt. Exodus 10, verse 21. So it is with the soul apart from God, he preached. It stumbles blindly, groping in the dark, unable to find the way. The metaphor pierced deeply, because many in his audience had walked through the fog-choked streets of London or Chicago, unable to see even a hand's breadth ahead. Moody brought that concrete reality into the realm of the spirit, showing that to live estranged from the Creator is to wander endlessly in such a night, directionless, hopeless, and without a guide. The dramatic image stirred not only fear, but also an aching thirst for light, preparing his hearers to long for the reconciliation he was about to unfold. Moody then turned to the lie of false freedom. He warned that countless souls believe themselves free because they choose their own paths, yet in truth they are bound in unseen chains. You think you are masters of yourselves, he declared, but you are slaves to sin, dragged into places you never wished to go. The imagery of bondage carried immense weight, especially in a time when the echoes of slavery's abolition still rang through America and England. The audience grasped instantly the gravity of the comparison. Separation from God does not liberate, it enslaves. In that moment, illusions of independence shattered, and Moody revealed the sobering reality that true freedom exists only in the presence of the Lord. Finally, at the height of his sermon, Moody reminded them that separation is not merely a human condition. It is an affront to the very love of God. God created you to walk with him, he cried, not to live estranged. Every step away from him is a fresh wound in the heart of the Creator. The tone of the message shifted here, from stern judgment to tender compassion. Those words broke many who listened, for they understood that separation was not only their tragedy, but also grief to the one who had formed them. In that sacred moment, Moody led his hearers to a crossroads. Either remain distant, sunk in spiritual death, or answer the call to God who still, in love, was searching for man. The atmosphere thickened with expectation, every soul waiting breathless for the revelation of what would come next. As Moody drew this part of the message to a close, he made it clear that separation was the most devastating consequence of Eden, and that every human being, from that moment on, is born distant from the Creator. He declared that this distance could not be measured in steps, but in eternity. You may cross oceans, you may reach the stars with your inventions, he said, but you will still remain infinitely far from God if you do not hear his voice. Bold and visionary for the 19th century, this comparison exposed the limits of human achievement when set against eternity. Even with the scientific advances that dazzled his generation, Moody reminded them that nothing could shorten the chasm carved by sin. Every word heightened the awareness that separation was not just a passing condition, but a destiny that had to be faced with urgency. He illustrated this destiny as a perpetual exile, like Adam and Eve driven from Eden, forbidden to return to the tree of life. You were created for the presence of God, he said, but you chose to turn away, and now you stand outside the garden, far from the source of eternal life. The imagery was powerful, confronting everyone with the reality of living outside what they were created to be. Moody reminded them that the separation bred loneliness, fear, and despair, feelings all too common, yet signs that something essential had been lost. As they listened, many realized their deepest struggles were not merely emotional or social, but spiritual, the invisible mark of being far from God. Yet Moody did not end in despair. He proclaimed that if the separation was deep, the love of God was deeper still. The very one who drove Adam out of the garden came into the world through Christ to open the way back. This unexpected turn at the height of the tension rekindled hope in the hearts of his listeners. The chasm was real, but not uncrossable. The distance was eternal, but it had been bridged by divine sacrifice. It was a foreshadowing of the solution he would yet unfold, but enough already to draw tears, prayers, and decisions in that very moment. The audience felt they stood before a profound mystery, on the verge of being unveiled. And so, as he concluded his exposition on separation, Moody left a question hanging in the air. If God is still calling you today, how much longer will you remain distant? Simple and direct, it was a bridge to the next theme, keeping spiritual tension alive. And here, Let me also ask you in a gentle and heartfelt way, have you been blessed by this story? Thank you for staying with us this far. If this message has spoken to your heart, subscribe, like, and share so that others may hear this voice. Stay with us, because in the next accounts we will reveal even deeper truths about the voice that not only calls, but seeks, saves, and transforms. Moody began this new part of his message with a striking contrast. If sin had carved a vast chasm, the voice of God still echoed across the centuries and nations, calling the lost man back home. He painted the scene of Eden as an eternal portrait where love and judgment were intertwined. God could have remained silent forever, he said, but he chose to speak. And when he speaks, his voice is not that of a harsh judge, but of a father searching for his lost child. That statement broke down resistance, for it revealed that the question, "Where are you?" was not a cry of condemnation, but an invitation to reconciliation. Moody showed that every sermon, every line of scripture, every stirring of conscience was, in truth, the continuation of that same voice. And he reminded them, if today you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, Hebrews 3 verse 15. He made it clear that God's voice was not a distant echo, but a present, insistent, living reality still seeking men in their darkness. He went on to compare that voice to a sound that rises above the noise of the world. In the clamor of industrial streets, the grinding of machines, and the chatter of crowds, Moody declared that God's voice could still be heard in the depths of the soul. You may be surrounded by 1,000 sounds, he said, but there is one voice that pierces through them all, gentle and steady, that asks, "Where are you?" That description was irresistible, for it carried the listeners into their own daily lives, where they realized that indeed there was a quiet, persistent voice they could not ignore. Moody showed that this was proof that God had not abandoned humanity. He insisted that the divine call remained as real in the packed halls of London or Chicago as it had been in the Garden of Eden. To strengthen the weight of that truth, he shared stories of transformation. He told of men who had spent years running from God, yet were captured by a single sermon or even a verse remembered from childhood. A man may block his ears to 1,000 human voices, he declared, but he cannot escape the voice of God when it calls him by name. These testimonies were powerful, showing that no heart was too hardened, no distance too great for the divine voice to reach. Moody insisted on presenting such accounts as living proof that the same voice which once called Adam was still calling at that very moment. Each story brought tears and stirred hope, rekindling conviction that no one was beyond the reach of grace. At the height of his appeal, Moody declared, "I am not here to bring you my voice, but to help you hear the voice of God. It is not me you must answer, but him." That powerful distinction places audience face to face not with a preacher, but with the Creator himself. The atmosphere grew heavy with solemnity, and countless testimonies recalled that it felt as though God was speaking directly to each heart. This was Moody's gift, to remove himself from the stage so that only the divine voice remained, echoing irresistibly. And so the question, "Where are you?" became a personal call, unshakable, inescapable, capable of redefining an entire life for anyone courageous enough to answer. Moody pressed on with an even more intimate tone, as if the very hall where he preached had been transformed into a sacred space where the voice of God moved among the people, calling them one by one. He explained that this voice didn't always come like thunder or an earthquake, but more often as a gentle whisper to heart, reminding them of Elijah on Mount Horeb in 1 Kings 19 verses 11 to 12. "You expect great signs," he said, "but the God who asks, 'Where are you?' speaks within you in silence at the very moment you least expect." That revelation carried weight, because many realized they had already felt that same stirring in ordinary moments, alone in their rooms, at work, or walking down the street. Moody showed them this was no coincidence, but God himself persistently reaching out. The true power of his message lay in exposing the fact that even the most resistant hearts in that room had already heard that voice at some point in their lives. He emphasized that this voice carried not only love, but also urgency. God is not calling you tomorrow. He is calling you today, he proclaimed with authority. Then he added, "Tomorrow may never come. The voice you hear right now is the same voice that may fall silent forever." The atmosphere grew heavy with that warning, for it revealed the danger of ignoring the divine call. Moody made it clear that the chance to answer God was always a gift, never a guarantee. It was as if every listener stood before an open door that could shut at any moment. The thought stirred both fear and hope. Fear of wasting the moment, and hope that there was still time to respond. Moody then turned to simple, yet striking metaphors to describe this voice that calls. He said it was like a light in the darkness, a lighthouse shining through a storm. The ship may be lost at sea, but as long as the light shines, there is hope of finding the way. In his time, when sea travel was common and its dangers well known, that picture struck deep. The people instantly understood. The voice of God was that unfailing light, always pointing toward salvation. The image awakened not only intellectual understanding, but a deep sense of need. For ignoring the light was nothing less than choosing shipwreck. And as he brought this part of the message to a close, Moody reminded them that the voice of God has never been neutral. It always demands a response. You may cover your ears, but you cannot erase the sound that has already entered your conscience. Today, the God who once called Adam is calling you. The question is, will you remain in hiding or will you come out to meet him? That direct appeal made the congregation feel they stood before a decision that could not be postponed. The call was not just a memory from the past, nor a religious concept, but a living, personal, and transformative summons. The hall itself seemed turned into a battlefield of the soul, where the voice of God wrestled with human excuses, and many were already breaking down in tears, surrendering at last. Moody pressed on with his sermon, showing that the voice that calls does not fall silent in the face of human resistance, but persists with patience, like a shepherd searching for a lost sheep in the middle of the night. He quoted Luke 15, verse 4, "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it?" To reveal that the voice of God is never generic, but deeply personal, aimed at every heart. You may be hiding in the deepest valley, he declared, but he still calls you by name, not to expose you, but to rescue you. That statement drew tears, because it revealed that no one was beyond the reach of heaven. Moody knew that many in his audience carried hidden sins and believed they were unworthy of forgiveness. That's why he emphasized that God's persistent call was the ultimate proof of a love that refuses to give up. He also made it clear that this voice often breaks in at the most unexpected moments, as if to prove that grace knows no boundaries. He told stories of men who were called in the stillness of a hospital room, of young people who heard that voice in the clamor of busy streets, of mothers who felt it while weeping for their children. Each testimony was living proof that the question, "Where you?" is still alive and active. Moody would say, "You may try to hide behind your business in the crowd or even in dead religion, but the voice of God always finds its way to the depths of your soul." That relentless pursuit brought both comfort and unease, because it showed that while God never gives up, his call can never be ignored forever. Moody went on to stress that God's voice doesn't speak only to soothe, but also to confront. He warned that many confuse love with indulgence, but the true love of God reveals itself in calling people out of sin. If you hear his voice and remain unmoved, you are choosing to stay in darkness. The call isn't meant to make you feel comfortable, but to bring you out of hiding. This direct appeal created discomfort, but it also sparked decisions. The crowd understood that God's invitation demanded action, either to respond or to keep running. Neutrality was impossible. God's persistent voice was not simply meant to console fallen humanity, but to radically transform it, restoring mankind to the fellowship lost in Eden. To seal this point, Moody returned to the heart of the biblical account, God walking the garden, calling out to Adam. Can you imagine the creator of the universe coming down to seek the very man who betrayed him? That is the ultimate proof that he has not given up on you. Those words thundered through the room, shattering resistance and stirring hope. The people realized that the voice which calls is the greatest evidence that heaven's doors have not been shut to humanity. And in that moment, Moody led his listeners to see God's call not as a cruel accusation, but as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for redemption. The atmosphere grew heavy with expectation, as everyone recognized they were standing face to face with that same voice. And ignoring would be the most dangerous choice of all. As Moody pressed on in his message, he intensified the idea that God's voice is not just a distant call, but a direct intervention in the life of every sinner. He reminded his listeners that, just as in Eden, God still steps into the garden of every heart. even when that heart is scarred by fear and shame. You can hide behind 1,000 excuses, he declared, but the voice of God breaks through them all and reaches the very depths of your soul. The impact was immediate. Many realized that even though they had tried to ignore it, they could not escape the insistent whisper of God's presence in their conscience. Moody described it as a relentless pursuit of love, where God would not rest until the lost were found. The crowd, deeply moved, understood that this voice was not only a voice of justice, but above all, the voice of a love that refuses to give up. He went on to emphasize that this voice, though gentle, is irresistibly powerful. He told stories of people who had resisted sermon after sermon, but in a single moment were broken down by a simple phrase, a verse of scripture, or even a hymn sung in faith. It isn't the eloquence of the preacher. It isn't the beauty of the song, he said. It is the voice of God, speaking where human words could never reach. In that moment, it became clear that behind every true transformation, there was always a direct work of the Holy Spirit. The congregation understood that this was not human persuasion, but something far greater, something supernatural. It was the very same voice that spoke creation into being, now calling sinners by name and summoning them back to life. Moody then confronted those who still hesitated, warning them that ignoring his voice was nothing less than playing games of eternity. How many times have you heard this call and stayed silent? How many times have you promised to change and gone back to the same life? Each time you resist, you grow colder, more distant, more hardened. The weight of these words filled the hall with a heavy silence, as many recognized their own story in his warning. He reminded them that the voice of God could not be treated as something ordinary, because any call could be the last. The urgency was undeniable. They had to respond today, while their hearts were still open and tender enough to hear. And at the climax of this appeal, Moody reaffirmed that this voice was not a sentence of condemnation, but a call of hope. If God is still calling, it is because he still desires to save, he proclaimed firmly. That single phrase filled the crowd like healing balm, breaking down resistance and drawing tears from hardened eyes. The atmosphere became a mixture of awe and comfort, judgment and love, preparing the audience for a life-changing decision. And now, dear listener, let me ask you, are you being touched by this message? Thank you for staying with us this far. If this word has spoken to your heart, subscribe, share it, and keep walking with us. In the next messages, we will uncover even deeper truths about how this voice not only calls, but reshapes destinies and ignites revivals that have set generations aflame. Moody closed this part of his message by showing that the voice that calls is not just a sound that echoes, but a force that transforms lives. He said, every time God asks, "Where are you?" he isn't seeking information, he's giving you an opportunity. It's as if all of heaven leans down toward you, waiting for your answer. That image gripped the hearts of his listeners, for it revealed they weren't standing before an ordinary preacher, but before the Creator himself, calling with urgency and tenderness. Moody reminded them that if a man rejected that voice, he chose to remain hidden in separation. But he answered, even with fear and shame, he would find arms wide open to receive and restore. He concluded with the solemn declaration, "It isn't my voice, but the voice of God, and it still asks, 'Where are you?'" He stressed that this voice was not confined by time, space, or circumstance. It could be heard in a palace or in a field, in the middle of a crowd or in the silence of the night, by the young and the old, the rich and the poor. No one is too far, no one too lost, no one too hidden, he proclaimed. The universality of that call filled the room with hope. Many who had believed themselves beyond God's reach felt as though their chains were breaking as they realized there was still a chance. It was as if that voice penetrated every corner of the human heart, reaching forgotten places and reigniting a faith thought long extinguished. Moody shaped each word so the audience didn't merely hear the message but saw themselves inside it. He said the divine call was like a seed planted deep in the heart, ready to spring to life right there. You may ignore it today, but tomorrow that same voice will return, and it may hurt even more, for every time you resist, the distance grows wider. That truth drew sighs and tears, for it laid bare the seriousness of the decision. Many felt that exact moment was their time to respond, to step out of hiding and surrender. The atmosphere was charged with spiritual tension, yet equally with a hope that could be felt. At the final point of his message, Moody placed before everyone the inevitability of a response. You may choose to ignore, but even silence is an answer. God calls, and now it is up to you to decide. Will you remain hidden, or will you step into his presence? The hall remained in absolute silence, the weight of eternity pressing on every heart. Moody reminded them that the call wasn't just for a few, but for all who could hear. What seemed like a personal choice in that moment also carried historic consequence, because transformed lives would ripple out to touch families, communities, even nations. "Where are you?" now rang as a divine decree, demanding an immediate response. And now, dear listener, let me ask you, has that voice spoken to your heart? If these words have reached you, I thank you for walking with us this far. Subscribe, share this message, and stay with us, because in the next account, we will unveil the most decisive moment of all, the urgency of the response that can change not only your life, but your eternity. Moody entered the most solemn part of his message by making it clear that hearing the voice of God without responding was just as serious as rejecting it outright. He declared, "You may be standing before the most glorious invitation and still lose it forever if you do not answer today." That word today was the key to his preaching. He repeated Hebrews 4 verse 7. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, showing that God's call is never for tomorrow, but always for now. The urgency in his tone helped the audience understand that spiritual procrastination was one of the enemy's greatest strategies. Moody compared it to a man who, standing inside a burning house, decides to wait until the next day to escape. "Would you do that?" he asked. The silence of the crowd was the obvious answer. No. In that moment, he made it unmistakably clear that eternity was at stake in every passing second, and the decision could not be delayed. He then exposed the danger of a heart hardened by delay. Every time you say tomorrow, you are building another wall between yourself and God, he warned. That metaphor struck deep, showing that indecision was not neutral, but a step closer to rejection. Moody reminded them that many in his day had left meetings saying they would decide later, but never had another chance, because death caught them by surprise. Such accounts shook the crowd, forcing them to realize that the time of salvation was not in their control. Life was uncertain, and only the present moment belonged to them. He drove the point home with another image, a ship about to sink. You would not wait until tomorrow to jump into the lifeboat. Then why wait to throw yourself into the arms of Christ? Moody pressed further, insisting that the urgency of the response was not only tied to the danger of death, but also to the opportunity of abundant life. You have carried the weight of guilt and separation long enough. Do you still want to wait before knowing peace? This rhetorical question pierced both mind and heart. He told them that every minute without Christ was a wasted minute, a life lived below the divine purpose. God is not calling you only to heaven in the future, but to transformation right now, in this life, in this very moment. Many felt as if they were losing not just eternity, but also the fullness of life God had prepared for them. It was a promise of immediate freedom, healing for the soul, and reconciliation that could begin at once. Finally, Moody made his most emotional appeal. Today, this very hour, you can change the course of your eternity. Do not leave this place without answering the voice that calls. The door is open, but it may soon close. The weight of his words was irresistible. Men broke down in tears. Young people rushed to the altar. Entire families surrendered together. The hall was transformed into a field of eternal decisions. And now, dear listener, I ask you, how long will you delay your answer? If this message is spoken to your heart, I thank you for staying with us until now. Subscribe, share, and keep following, because what comes next will reveal even more powerful accounts of how a single decision can transform generations and ignite the fire of a true revival. Moody pressed on, raising the tone of his message even higher, leading his listeners to a point of no return. He declared that the decision before the voice of God could never be treated as an ordinary choice, but as the most solemn and urgent decision of life itself. You can make choices about business, about studies, about travel, and later change your mind. But the decision about eternity is not like that. Every moment that passes without Christ may be your last. His words struck like a hammer, awakening a sense of spiritual urgency in every heart. He reminded them of funerals in his own time. Young men who had left his meetings convinced they had plenty of time, but whose lives were suddenly cut short. They said tomorrow, but tomorrow never came. That warning was devastating because it revealed procrastination was not merely careless. It was deadly. He then drove home the contrast between God's call and the enemy's deception. God always says, today. The devil always says, tomorrow. That simple but powerful phrase became one of the most quoted lines from his sermons. Moody made it clear that every heart that postponed was in reality surrendering to Satan's lie. He reminded his listeners that the Bible never promised another day to respond. It always points to now. Quoting 2 Corinthians 6 verse 2, he read aloud, "Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation." The impact was immediate. People realized they stood at an invisible boundary. Every delay was like taking one step closer to the edge of an abyss. Moody also spoke of the deceptive nature of the human heart. You think you'll feel more willing tomorrow, but the truth is that tomorrow you'll be colder, harder, more distant. He compared the conscience to a hot iron. The first touch burns sharply, but when pressed again and again, the skin grows numb. So it is with the heart before the voice of God. Each time you resist, you grow less sensitive until you feel nothing at all. The image was terrifying, showing that ignoring the call was not simply postponing. It could close forever the ability to hear. And then, in a tender yet authoritative appeal, Moody affirmed, "You don't need to leave here without peace. You can have the assurance of salvation today. You can lay down the weight of guilt right now. You can cross from the abyss of separation into the arms of Christ this very moment." That invitation rang out like immediate freedom, stirring tears and decisions across the hall. He showed them it was not necessary to wait for extraordinary signs or outward changes. It was enough to answer in the heart by faith to the divine call. The crowd, gripped by the urgency, understood that the decision could not be postponed, because tomorrow might never come. Moody intensified his appeal, driving his listeners to a climax where every word landed like a direct blow against indecision. He declared, "You stand before an invitation that can change the course of your life and your eternity. To refuse is to choose to remain in darkness." The crowd fell into reverent silence, as if all of eternity hinged on those very minutes. For Moody, there was no middle ground. Every person stood before the cross, choosing between life and death, salvation and condemnation. He reminded them that, just as in Deuteronomy 30 verse 19, God himself placed a choice before all. "I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your children may live." That clarity shattered every attempt at neutrality. The message made it undeniable. Not deciding was in itself the most dangerous decision of all. He reinforced this urgency with vivid illustrations. He told stories of men who, after resisting many appeals, were suddenly taken by death without ever surrendering to Christ. Those accounts, though painful, served as living warnings. No one had a guarantee of tomorrow. "You don't have to be a great sinner to be lost," he declared. "All it takes is postponing your response." That simple yet piercing phrase struck deeply, revealing that the greatest danger was not only obvious sin, but the silent neglect of the soul. As the words sank in, many felt as though the ground beneath them had vanished, realizing they were standing on the edge of an abyss without even knowing it. Moody spoke further of the priceless opportunity, wrapped up in the present moment. "The Holy Spirit is here, speaking to you now. Do not harden your hearts. If today you hear the voice of God, answer him." That plea, delivered with both intensity and tenderness, broke hardened men into tears and moved women to cry out in surrender right where they sat. The conviction was overwhelming. No one could remain indifferent. It was as if the entire congregation had been carried back to Eden itself, hearing that same question, "Where are you?" But this time with a chance to answer differently than Adam, not by hiding, but by running into the arms of God. At the height of his appeal, Moody declared, "All of heaven awaits your response. It is not only your life at stake, but the destiny of your soul for all eternity." That statement lifted the decision into a cosmic scale, showing that every response was witnessed by angels, recorded in the book of life, and celebrated at the throne of the Lamb. The impact of those words was both devastating and glorious. mingling fear with hope in a single irresistible call. The congregation understood. In that very moment, there was no room left for delay. The time to decide was now. Moody moved to the most sensitive point of his message, a direct confrontation with the conscience of every listener. He no longer spoke only of humanity as a whole, but fixed his gaze on each person as if addressing them individually. God is not asking where the whole world is, he said with firmness and compassion. He's asking where you are. That personal focus made hearts race, because everyone felt the divine voice calling them by name. Moody reminded them that eternity would not be decided by family heritage, social status, or inherited religiosity, but by the response of each soul. Your father cannot answer for you. Your mother cannot answer for you. Not even your church can answer for you. This decision is yours before God. That clarity stripped away excuses, leaving everyone exposed before the undeniable need for a personal and immediate choice. He then painted the picture of a courtroom, where a defendant cannot rely on the crowd to speak on his behalf. So it will be on the great day, he preached. You will stand before the eternal judge, and no other voice will speak in your place. The only thing that will matter is whether you answer God's call while there was still time. This comparison with human justice was clear to all, but carried infinitely greater weight when applied to eternity. Many felt as if they were already standing in that courtroom, waiting for the sentence to be read. Conviction spread like fire, and tears streamed down the faces of men and women who understood that this was a moment of decision. Moody pressed even further, showing that indecision itself was the greatest enemy of faith. You can believe in the Bible, you can believe in God, you can even believe in Christ, but if you don't respond, you remain lost. Faith that doesn't respond is not living faith. That statement dismantled the false security of many who leaned on theoretical beliefs without ever truly surrendering. He emphasized that true faith is always accompanied by surrender, confession, and decision. Tomorrow may be too late, but today heaven opens before you. The entire congregation felt as though they were being carried to a breaking point. Either remain in the silence of separation or step into the embrace of reconciliation. And, bringing this portion of his message to its conclusion, Moody declared, Christ is not far away. He is here. He calls, he waits, he extends his hand. Eternity is decided in a single moment, and that moment is now. His words echoed like both hammer and melody, creating an atmosphere where the fear of loss and hope of salvation mingled with irresistible force. It was a herald of final climax, where every heart will be invited to give its definitive response. The weight of urgency became unbearable, yet glorious, for it showed that the moment of salvation had truly arrived. Moody closed this part of his message as if sealing an eternal decree. His voice, steady yet charged with emotion, cut through the silence of the crowd. Eternity stands before you. Today, right now, is the moment when you can change the course of your life forever. The question is, will you remain hidden or will you answer the voice that calls? The impact was immediate. Many were already weeping openly. Others rose from their seats in surrender, while hardened hearts were finally broken. Moody made it clear that neutrality did not exist. Silence itself was already a response. He reminded them that salvation was not only a promise of the future, but a present reality. Christ can forgive, set you free, and restore you this very moment. That now sounded like a trumpet blast, stirring the conviction that there was no more time to waste. He emphasized that this decision was not limited to the individual, but spread outward like waves of revival, touching families, cities, and even nations. A surrendered heart can reignite the flame of an entire household, and a transformed home can set generations ablaze, he proclaimed. This vision magnified both the responsibility and the hope of those listening. They understood that their choice would not only affect their own lives, but also shape the future of everyone around them. Moody showed that the urgency of the response was not merely personal. It carried within the potential to unleash a spiritual revolution. At the climax, he painted the scene from Revelation 3 verse 20. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in. Moody looked across the crowd and declared, that door is your heart. Christ does not force his way in. He waits for your decision. What will you do now? The imagery was irresistible, as each person saw themselves standing before a door that had to be opened immediately. There were no more excuses, no more delays. The call was unmistakable, and the response could no longer be postponed. And so, he ended his exhortation with both tenderness and authority. God still asks, "Where are you?" But the answer belongs to you alone. Today, this very moment, eternity leans over your life. Choose Christ, and you will never be the same. The weight of his words hung over the room like holy fire, pressing every listener toward an inevitable decision. And to you, dear viewer, I want to say thank you for walking with us this far. Has this message touched your heart? If it has, then take action now. Subscribe, share, and carry forward this voice that still calls. Stay with us, because the conclusion will unveil even deeper revelations of how this divine call not only saves, but also begins a journey of revival, transformation of faith, and eternal impact. We've reached the highest point of this journey, the conclusion of a message that echoes from Eden all the way to our time. The divine question, "Where are you?" has crossed the centuries and found in Moody a herald who brought it to life for the multitudes. And today, that very same question comes to you. The lost Eden revealed the fall, guilt exposed the burden, separation uncovered the abyss, and the voice that calls brought hope. But the answer, the decision, rests in every heart. Here is where eternity is defined. Now is the moment when the line between darkness and light, death and life, can no longer be ignored. There is no neutrality before this call. Either you remain hidden or you run to the God who seeks you. This message is not confined to isolated individuals. It carries within it the power to ignite generations. A single transformed heart can spark the fire of revival that crosses borders, tears down strongholds, and ushers in a spiritual revolution. The same Christ who once called humble fishermen to change the course of history still calls ordinary men and women to transform families, cities, and entire nations. Eternal impact is not a distant promise. It begins here and now, the very moment you choose to answer the divine call. The fire that once burned through Moody's pulpits can blaze in your own life, reigniting faith, bringing spiritual freedom, and ushering in a season of miracles, healing, and restoration. Today, the voice that echoes is not just memory. It is a living reality. God still asks, "Where are you?" He calls you to step out of hiding, to lay down the weight of guilt, and to cross the bridge of reconciliation. This is a moment to answer, to surrender, to allow the spiritual revolution to begin in you. May this word be like a flame that never goes out, rekindling your faith and leading you to eternal impact that rewrites stories and forges new destinies. For the true reward is not merely in hearing, but in answering, allowing the fire of revival to transform your life and flow like a river of life through all those around you. This is a decisive moment. Don't let this message be just another sound lost in the wind. If God's voice has spoken to you today, if the fire of revival has touched your soul and stirred within you a longing for transformation, then act now. Subscribe to this channel and walk with us in this spiritual revolution. Turn on notifications so you don't miss a single word that could change the course of your eternity, and share this message so others may be reached as well. Don't keep to yourself what has the power to ignite generations. Write your response in the comments, where you stand before God. Declare with faith what this word has stirred in your life, and become living proof that eternal impact begins with one decision today. The time is now. The opportunity is unique, and your action may be the spark of a transformation that can never be erased.